So if the esteemed judging panel is then ready, and Mr. Topper, and Mr. Tran, and the audience.
Yes.
I assume all of you are ready, so
Before
let's
we
get started.
begin, let's congratulate these great.
All right, let's get started. On October 9th in 2012, an attempt was made on the life of a young Afghani girl named Malala Yousafzai. What action caused this violence? Did Malala try to break the law, incite violence, or otherwise try and kill other people or harm their rights? No. The reason why the Taliban put their community moral standards upon Malala and tried to silence her forever was because she used her freedom of speech to speak out for the rights of women everywhere, to be able to gain an education and to advance in their lives. It is because I agree that this instance goes to show the importance of valuing freedom of speech over the moral standards of the community that I hope you will stand with me, that when in conflict, an individual's freedom of speech ought to be valued above a community's moral standards. With this in mind, let's look at my definitions. Freedom of speech is defined by the Encyclopedia Britannica as the right as stated in the First and 14th Amendments to the Constitution of the United States to express information, ideas, and opinions free of government restrictions based on content. A community is defined by Oxford Dictionary as a group of people living in the same place or having a particular characteristic in common. And finally, a moral standard is defined by Merriam-Webster as an accepted concept of right and wrong behavior. With this in mind, let's examine my value, or the highest goal that we should be pursuing in this round. My value is of human dignity. Human dignity, which is defined as the act of respecting the intrinsic worth of every human being by upholding their rights to life, liberty, and property. Human dignity is the highest value in today's debate round for one main reason to prefer, or value warrant, and that is that it protects every human life as precious. It protects every human life as precious. Human dignity is the common denominator for all of mankind. And when a society undervalues or disrespects our innate human dignity, a violation of rights and a loss of the freedom of speech necessarily follows. And with this in mind, let's look at the core meat of my case and my three contentions. Contention 1, free speech must protect views that contradict the community. Free speech must protect views that contradict the community. This is so because if it does not contradict the community or have the freedom to, it ceases to be free speech. And people live in fear of being jailed, tortured, or killed for their opinions. We can see this in the Roman Inquisition. The Roman Inquisition. During this time, the Catholic Church actively persecuted those who used their freedom of speech to speak out on theological issues that were opposed to the Catholic Church's ideology. As a result of the Catholic Church's community moral standards, they imprisoned, tortured, and killed thousands of people. Contention 2, free speech is fundamental to all other freedoms. Free speech is fundamental to all other freedoms because it serves as their protector. Benjamin Franklin once sagely put it, quote, "Whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freeness of speech," end quote. An example of this is of Hill versus Colorado. Hill versus Colorado, where peaceful protests in front of abortion clinics were disallowed within 100 feet of the abortion clinic, and counselors could not come within 8 feet of the women entering the clinic, effectively eliminating their freedom of speech. Justice Kennedy, in his eloquently written dissenting opinion, wrote, quote, "The court's holding contradicts more than a half-century of well-established First Amendment principles. For the first time, the court approves a law which bars a private citizen from passing a message to a fellow citizen on a public sidewalk on a profound moral issue. If from this time forward the court repeats its grave errors of analysis, such as in this case, then we shall no longer have the free and proud tradition of a free and open discourse in a public forum," end quote. Which leads me to my third and final contention. Community moral standards violate human dignity. Community moral standards violate human dignity. My A sub-point is of Elaine Photography and Houston Pastors. In a world where you value community moral standards, whatever the community says is right, and you will necessarily oppress those who disagree with you. For example, a couple in New Mexico who openly said that they would not photograph a gay marriage, the community said their freedom of speech was being used as hate speech. Also, the very recent controversy surrounding the Houston city government subpoenaing pastors for all of their sermons is particularly disturbing. According to the Houston Chronicle on October 15th of 2014, this is an unbelievable violation of the rights to freedom of speech and religion. The pastors have not changed their views, nor have they changed what the Bible said, but it's rather what the community's moral standards have changed to view their speech as wrong. They are inconsistent. Which leads me to my B subpoint, the Nazi March protected. The Nazi March protected. While the community says that Christians can't peacefully speak out lovingly on their views, they say that the Nazis can spew their hate and shout death to homosexuals in the streets, which indicates that moral standards are unjust, fickle, and inconsistent. Which leads me to my C subpoint, the impact. Valuing moral standards leads to injustice and inconsistency. If you vote for community moral standards, you are voting for standards that are completely inconsistent, a moving target and goalpost with what is right and what is wrong, and what will be allowed and what will not be allowed. Under freedom of speech, you are siding with the champions of our liberty, the champions of our human dignity, such as Malala Yousafzai, who has now won a Nobel Peace Prize, which actually happens to mean something. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm now open for cross-examination.
Are all the judges ready? And the timer? And Mr. Buck?
Yes.
All right, let's begin. Again, congratulations on making it this far. I think we're both very happy to be here.
I am very happy as well. Congratulations to you.
Thank you. So just some questions about your case.
Sure.
First of all, starting off with your definition of freedom of speech.
Yes.
You define this as protected by the First and 14th Amendments to the Constitution, correct?
The rights as stated in these amendments, yes.
Right. So we're looking at an American view of freedom of speech, right?
We're looking at what we have articulated in the First and 14th Amendments, yes.
Should we not look then at American examples instead of things like the Roman Inquisition?
I believe that what the American interpretation is of free speech is the most real world, and it is the most applicable to the most examples. If you provide this argument in the round, I'd be happy to provide more analysis.
Of course, but to bring you back to my question, this is freedom of speech defined by America. So does the example of the Roman Inquisition still apply?
Absolutely, because the American definition is the most equitable for both sides in the debate. Just because America has defined something doesn't mean that it cannot be used to extend to other analysis.
And that's my next question.
Sure.
Does the definition of freedom of speech change from country to country?
Freedom of speech itself doesn't change. The moral standards of the community regarding the regulations of free speech are what changing.
So freedom of speech never changes? Is that your
Freedom of
position?
speech doesn't change, no, but the community moral standards always change from community to community.
Okay, thank you. Moving down to your contention one, you brought up freedom of speech must protect views that contradicts the community.
Yes.
So you would agree that freedom of speech would have to protect things like racist and discriminatory views if it went against the community moral standard, right?
Well, I have two different answers to that. First of all, I do believe that the Supreme Court does not regard that as free speech. Secondly, if you did prove that it actually is free speech, I believe that the benefits of upholding free speech for everyone far outweigh the minuscule disadvantages we would get from upholding the free speech of racist individuals.
Okay, but there is a possibility that racist speech is allowed under even the American definition of freedom of speech, correct?
And sure, and it's not my burden to prove that freedom of
course.
speech is perfect. It's my burden to prove that when in conflict, it should be upheld over community moral standards.
My point here simply is that there are good community moral standards, especially in the United States, and freedom of speech can often go against those standards, right?
While community moral standards may be good, that is not my burden to disprove.
Right.
My burden is to prove that in general, freedom of speech should be upheld. So yeah, of course there are some good community moral standards because there's some good communities. There's also far more bad community moral standards and far more bad communities, and that's what I've proven.
My very last question, we'll have to deal with, once again, this whole issue of freedom of speech. Who imposes these regulations on freedom of speech?
Which ones?
The regulations, the restrictions that say you cannot use your freedom of speech.
Our founding fathers articulated what what their ideas of freedom of speech was, and then what is currently going on is the government is the one who's enforcing these various
and we accept
ideas.
these, and we accept this definition of freedom of speech, correct?
Yes.
Thank you. Are the judges ready? And the timer? Okay. I would agree with my opponent on almost every single issue, and it would in fact concede the round, but for one major thing. Who puts the limits on freedom of speech? I want you to write that down, Judge, under the definitions. Who puts the limits on freedom of speech? You see, Evan brought up the definition of freedom of speech as the right guaranteed by the First and 14th Amendments to the Constitution. This places certain restrictions on freedom of speech. Restrictions such as incitement to violence if not under free speech, libel, slander, etc. What does that mean? What does that mean? It means that a community, their moral standards codified in something called the Constitution, is overriding freedom of speech. Again, the community moral standard is overriding freedom of speech. If we look at the specific definition of freedom of speech, this is an example of where the community, the United States is one of the biggest examples of this, has a moral standard. And one of those moral standards is that freedom of speech must be restricted to certain times. And so once again, Judge, this is a key issue. I'll be applying this throughout the round as we move down. I'll be starting first with the negative case and then moving up to the affirmative case to see, again, whether these ideas apply. Starting off with my value of protection of the innocent. Again, protection of the innocent. I believe that it is vital and, in fact, necessary for us to protect those who are defenseless or those who cannot help themselves. And for reasons stated later, I will address Evan's value when I move up to his case. My contention one is that limitations are necessary. Again, limitations on freedom of speech by the community, they are necessary. Our first example under this is military secrets. Again, military secrets. The example of this is the Rosenbergs, who in World War II, they were accused of selling military secrets, and as a result, they were executed. My question to you is, why were they executed? Because the community said, you cannot threaten the safety of the American citizens. That goes against our moral code. That goes against our moral standards. And so they restricted someone's freedom of speech and said, you can't do that. That's the community. My second example under this is the watershed hour. Again, the watershed hour. Now, the watershed hour is basically this hour before which TV shows cannot be broadcast with explicit or inappropriate material because children might watch the show. Again, why is this watershed hour in place? Because the community has said we cannot have freedom of speech going so far as to violating our children's privacy, our children's innocence. And what does that mean? A community's moral standard is once again restricting freedom of speech. The impact of this whole contention is that freedom of speech needs a community to regulate it. Again, freedom of speech needs a community moral standard to even exist in the first place. My second contention, unrestrained freedom of speech is self-defeating. Again, unrestrained freedom of speech is self-defeating. My first example under this is communism. Now, communism is an excellent example of where leaders rose to power, not on the ladder of crushing human rights immediately, but rather they rose to power on the ladder of free speech. It's interesting to note that once they reached that apex, in the words of Herbert Hoover, they immediately silenced everyone else's free speech but their own. And so we see that we do need these limits on freedom of speech. This brings me to my second application, that all nations do have restrictions. All nations have restrictions. All nations understand that freedom of speech is dangerous, and that is why there is no nation that claims to have freedom of speech that does not put some sort of restriction on it. And once again, Judge, I want you to think in terms of the resolution. When in conflict, individuals' freedom of speech and the community's moral standard, the freedom of speech is limited by what the community says. And this is a perfect example, especially in the United States. Again, the impact of this, community moral standards actually preserve freedom of speech, because without it, America would not be where it is today. Without a community moral standard supporting and allowing freedom of speech. Let's move on to my opponent's arguments to see where these ideas apply. Under the value of human dignity, I have several problems with this. My first problem is that it's vague. It's vague. The value of human dignity is hard to understand, and even the definition itself is nebulous. What is human dignity other than this kind of gauge of where we feel good about ourselves, or like we have this basic elemental right? My second response, however, is that it's unreliable because some people have different views of human dignity. Again, people have different views of human dignity. One group might say, look, human dignity depends on your state of mind. It depends only on what you think about yourself. Whereas other people would say human dignity would depend on extrinsic factors. So the problem here is that human dignity is not constrained to the one definition my opponent brought up, but rather it's an unreliable standard that we cannot use in this debate. This brings me to my opponent's contention 1. He said, freedom of speech must protect views that contradict the community moral standard. And against this, I would like to make an extension. Freedom of speech must protect views that go against good community moral standards. Again, good community moral standards. Once again, I point to the example of America. The only way that we have gotten here is because we have a community moral standard that allows freedom of speech to exist in the first place. And in fact, community moral standards are, in America, what limit freedom of speech to make sure that people are protected. This brings me down to the application of the Roman Inquisition. And I find this interesting since my opponent said, well, we're looking at the basic principles of freedom of speech, that freedom of speech is limited. And once again, Judge, even if you buy this example, I would say that it was limited by a community. Again, freedom of speech has to be limited by a community. Just look at the examples of the United States. Under contention 2, my opponent brought up that it is fundamental to all rights. However, I have several problems with this. First of all, it's not fundamental to everything. Again, not to every single right. Take, for example, excommunication. When you're excommunicated, you obviously don't have the freedom to speak in a certain community. But you still have all your rights, like life and liberty and property. So just because something is fundamental to some rights does not mean it is fundamental to all rights, or even the most important rights. Under contention 3, my opponent brought up that community moral standards violate this principle of human dignity. My response is, especially under Texas pastors and Nazis march was protected, my response, did the community really agree? Again, did the community really agree? If we think about this, Judge, the community of the United States did not agree with either of these examples. If we can just look at ourselves, we don't agree with these examples. And so I would say there is no conflict. For this reason, I strongly urge a negative ballot. Thank you. I stand open for cross-examination.
All right, so if all the judges are then ready. All right, and Mr. Tauber, Mr. Trent.
As always.
All right, then let's get started. Oh, pardon me, I almost gave myself a 7-minute cross-examination. Pardon that. Okay, I'm now ready to begin. All right, I have a few questions about your case. Now, you presented the value of protection of innocent, correct?
That is correct.
And it's basically the idea that we are giving we are helping to guard the rights of individuals who haven't committed crimes, who are ordinary everyday civilians, correct?
To some extent, yes. Those who cannot protect themselves or those who have not.
Sure.
Yes.
Now, you would agree that human dignity's overall purpose is to protect the innocent, correct?
To some extent, yes, but still, it's vague and we can't tell exactly what it is. We can't even quantify.
But
what human
would you agree that both values are trying to achieve the same end goal of protecting people's life, liberty, and property?
In essence, yes.
In essence, okay. And then looking at your contention 1, you discussed how limits are necessary. Just to be clear, you did agree with my definition of free speech, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And then looking under your military secrets idea. Now, with this military secrets, were the Rosenbergs speaking out about the military secrets, or were they selling the military secrets?
They were speaking the military secrets, selling the military secrets. I believe in this case, it's essentially the same.
Okay, so you believe they're the same. But did they actually talk about these, or were they just trying to pass them off to somebody else?
Did they talk about the secrets?
Or were they trying to pass them off to somebody else?
They were trying to pass them off to somebody else, but I believe they're using their freedom of speech to do so.
Okay, and then how did the Rosenbergs get caught?
How did the Rosenbergs get caught? I'm not sure of the exact historical situation.
Okay, thank you. Looking under the watershed hour. Now, with the watershed hour, it's essentially restricting certain materials, certain obscene materials from not being broadcast between certain hours on TV.
Correct.
Correct? Okay. Now, what happens for the other 23 hours of the day?
The other 23 hours of the day?
Are you
television
you're free to say what you wish on those other 23 hours, is that not correct?
You're free to say what you wish on the other 23 hours.
Okay, let me rephrase the question. The watershed hour is simply just that, a watershed hour, correct?
Right.
There isn't there isn't a perpetual limitation that you can't say anything obscene at all on TV, correct?
Of course.
Okay.
Okay, if you clarify like that. That
Yes.
makes sense.
Okay. And then looking at your contention too, you talk about communism. Now, with communism, were the individuals who were leading the charge for communism valuing speech, or were they trying to extinguish speech?
Were they valuing speech, or were they trying to extinguish?
To put it in a different way, does
Oh,
communism
okay.
does communism
okay.
want freedom of speech, or does it not want freedom of speech?
My contention here is not whether they want or don't want freedom of speech. The contention here is that they used freedom of speech.
That's all fine and good, but I would love for you to actually answer the question: does communism want freedom of speech?
If you want to put it in that kind of situation, no. But once again, they rose to power on the ladder of freedom of speech. The question is not
Okay.
whether they want it.
Okay, thank you. No further
All right.
questions. Thank you. All right, so if the judges are then ready. All right, and the timer, and Mr. Tran. All right, then let us begin. I'd like to go down the flow the same way that my opponent presented his ideas. So he first posited to you, the judges, who puts limits on freedom of speech, and then elucidated further, saying that community moral standards do, thus they must be higher. My response to this is that community moral standards limiting does not make it higher. Just because the moral standards of a community limit doesn't make it higher. In fact, what is the community doing every time they uphold freedom of speech? They're upholding freedom of speech over their own moral standards that are inclined to not protect free speech. Putting it in a different way, think of it as a treasure chest. Freedom of speech is the gold inside, and community moral standards is the chest. What are you going to value? You're going to value the gold inside, and that is what moral standards are doing. This argument doesn't actually prove that moral standards have any more weight than freedom of speech. This argument doesn't have conflict within it. Looking under the responses to his case, under the value of the protection of the innocent, this is essentially the same concept. We're going for the same goals. So when you weigh the round, weigh which side better protects the innocent and better protects human dignity. Under contention one, you talked about military seekers. My response is, first of all, not freedom of speech. Not freedom of speech. He agreed with my definition that it clearly says this isn't freedom of speech. However, my second response is that speech convicted. Speech convicted. The reason why the Rosenbergs were able to come to trial was because somebody spoke out against what they were doing. Thus, actually, freedom of speech self-regulated on itself. Looking under the watershed hour, my response is of, again, not free speech. Not free speech. When you look to the Miller versus California court case, obscenity is clearly delineated as not free speech. However, my second response is of a turn. 95% of speech upheld. Second response, turn. 95% of speech upheld. For only 1 hour, this speech is being restricted. For all of the other times of the day, the community is upholding freedom of speech above its own moral standards, allowing people to speak as they wish. So really, this actually goes to show the validity of free speech. Looking under his impact, that freedom of speech needs moral standards to exist, this is actually not true. Freedom of speech exists a part of moral standards. It is the moral standards of a community always change. Looking under communism, my response is of a turn. Community moral standards violating speech. The goals of when we're asked in Lincoln Douglas debate to do is to evaluate what people value. And so this is very important to what the crux of this application. Communism, the people proposing communism, sure, they used free speech, but that's not what they wanted. What they wanted was to eliminate free speech. Their moral standards were used to kill millions of people. Actually, this is a very devastating application against its side. The community's moral standards have killed millions under communism. Looking under his response of all nations have restrictions, my response is of, again, moral standards are not higher than speech for this reason. And finally, under the impact of preserving speech, you can cross-apply previous argumentation I provided. Now looking under the contention one of, he said that freedom of speech must protect views that go against good moral standards. This is true. My response is that you either protect all views or you protect no views. All views or no views. You either protect all views, which will include some bad things, or you protect no views, and you will destroy the rights of good people. Looking under his Roman Inquisition response, he said that it was limited by the community, but he didn't actually respond to the crux of the application, which was that the moral standards of the community were responsible for this. Under the second contention, he did not address the Hill versus Colorado example, so what we can see is that moral standards again destroyed rights. Finally, under the third contention, he dropped both my example, or he dropped my impact, which was that moral standards are fickle and inconsistent. This is crucial because he is agreeing that moral standards are under free speech. Thank you for your time.
Are all the judges ready? And the timer? Mr. Buck?
Yes.
Danish philosopher Soren Kierkegaard once humorously remarked, "People demand freedom of speech as a compensation for the freedom of thought, which they seldom use." With those words in mind, I'll be going down through my opponent's arguments and then listing some basic voting issues. Why, in fact, I believe the negative has won today's round. Let's look at the very top of the flow. My opponent brought up that community moral standards limiting doesn't mean it's higher. I have one simple response, and he said under this also, there is no conflict, and so it doesn't make it higher. Our response to this is look at the applications. Again, look at the application of the United States. We have community moral standards for a reason, and that is to limit freedom of speech. But this brings me to my second more important response, my opponent's own definition. My opponent's own definition. I believe that my opponent has in fact proved the resolution false by his own definition, because when we look at freedom of speech, it is a right guaranteed by the First and 14th Amendments to the Constitution, and also regulated by the Constitution. The Constitution is essentially the moral standard of the community in America. So, community moral standards are once again limiting and even defining freedom of speech in my opponent's examples. For this reason, I would say that community moral standards limiting freedom of speech does in fact make it higher, because when you have two in contention, one limits the other, making that one higher. Moving down to my opponent's next argument, under the value of human dignity, he brought up that we're working toward the same goal. My response is, I agree, we are working toward the same goal. So the end goal is who supports the value of either human dignity or protection of the innocent more. Whoever proves that more should win this debate round. Moving down to contention one of my opponent's arguments, he said that we should protect all views, or otherwise we have to protect no views. Our response to this is that it's not an all or nothing deal. Again, it's not an all or nothing deal. I know it's getting tiresome by now, but look at America. We restrict some views, we restrict some statements, but we do not restrict all statements. And that is a key point. It's not an all or nothing deal, as my opponent would have you believe. Under the example of the Roman Inquisition, my opponent brought up this is not community moral standards. My response is, even if you buy this argument that it was the community moral standards that caused all the problems, just look at the arguments against the contention itself and the analysis. On contention 2, a fundamental my opponent brought up, I didn't really address his main point. My response is that, unfortunately, my opponent also did not respond to my response, especially that of excommunication. I like to pull this across and impact this out. Well, again, this is not an all or nothing deal. If we lose freedom of speech, or if we slightly restrict freedom of speech, we are not destroying every other right. Under contention 3, my opponent brought up that the impact, once again, that it was fickle. I have two responses. First of all, my response still stands. Again, the response still stands. Unfortunately, my opponent did not adequately address my response, which was that the community doesn't agree. Now, I want to focus on this right here. In the example of both the Texas pastors and the Nazi March was protected, do we agree with this? Did the community at large really agree with these statements? No. When we hear it, we are outraged at it. Why? Well, because we don't believe it. So it's not the community's moral standards, rather it is the standard set by, say, a judge, and that's not a community, that is an individual. Moving down to the second response, which is going to be against his argument that it is fickle. My response to this is that community moral standards have to preserve freedom of speech. Again, they're the only things that even allow freedom of speech to be a thing, because without community moral standards, there is no such thing as freedom of speech. Without people saying freedom of speech is acceptable, there is no freedom of speech. Moving down to the negative case, my opponent brought up against military secrets two responses. First of all, it's not freedom of speech, and second of all, the speech was convicted. I have one simple response. The community moral standards limited. Again, the community moral standards limited. I believe, as according to the definition debate and the arguments there earlier, that this was in fact freedom of speech. However, I want to make an argument here as well that community moral standards once again limited their ability to speak. Think about that. The community said, we cannot allow you to endanger these lives, so we are limiting your ability to speak. We are punishing you because you spoke and it went against our moral code. Under the watershed hour, my opponent brought up obscenity and 95% of speech upheld. My response, my opponent missed the point. The point is that there are cases, in fact, a couple of cases, where the community moral standards must and do trump freedom of speech for the good of the community. Under the contention 2, my opponent brought up a term that community moral standards violate speech. My response to this is that then it's kind of a double standard. Again, kind of a double standard. See, the problem with my opponent's argument is that it means that community moral standards are then always the actor. Think about that. If community moral standards are always the actor, then an individual's freedom of speech can do nothing, because it's always the community that acts. Let's look at some voting issues to sum up this round and hopefully boil it down. My first voting issue, freedom of speech is limited by the community. This is perhaps the most important argument for the negative, and I believe that it is one that proves the resolution false. My opponent, in fact, defined freedom of speech as subject to restrictions set by the community. If freedom of speech is defined by the community, I believe that it is very clear it is also limited and by the community, and that the community is higher when it comes to conflict. My second voting issue is that community moral standards allow and preserve freedom of speech. Again, they allow and preserve freedom of speech. As I touched on earlier, the only way freedom of speech can exist is if a community says it is okay for it. And we also look under contention 2 that if it's unrestrained, then freedom of speech will only defeat itself. For these reasons, I strongly urge a negative ballot. Thank you.
Alright, so if the judges are then ready. Alright, and Mr. Toppin, and Mr. Tran, of course. Then let us finish this. Remember the example I presented at the beginning of this round. That is a Malala Yousafzai. Now what happened in this example, again, is that the moral standards of the Taliban were used to ruthlessly suppress her freedom of speech, and thankfully, a hero still lived, even despite this attack. And we have her inspiring example to live by today. Now, there are quite a few arguments that were in this round. In the short time I have remaining, I'll summarize them into a few key voting issues. Voting issue number 1, protection of community moral standards indicates that free speech is higher. The protection of moral standards indicates that free speech is higher. Now, he says, look at my own definition. However, there's a small problem with this. His logical fallacy is that he's assuming this is part of moral standards. But if you look at my definition, I define freedom of speech as having these limits. In other words, these limits are freedom of speech, not the moral standards of the community. He agreed with my definition, as I pointed out in my first affirmative rebuttal, so therefore he doesn't have any ground on to stand with regards to this argument. And also I presented the analogy of the treasure chest, which I would like to pull through. You have the treasure chest and you have the gold. Freedom of speech is the one that's being protected. Freedom of speech is the one that is higher. And community moral standards, he also didn't specifically respond to my point that community moral standards are placing their own priorities below upholding free speech. So with that, let's look at my second voting issue. Community moral standards lead to injustice. Community moral standards lead to injustice. Again, Hill versus Colorado was not responded to, so we have that application on my side. Under my third contention, he discussed the impact. I would like to point out that his second response was actually an entirely new response, as he did not present this in the constructive. But to respond to it anyway, he says that community moral standards have to preserve freedom of speech. But my point was, under this contention, that community moral standards change. They either do not protect the Christians, and they protect the Nazis. This point wasn't really adequately refuted. We can see that moral standards lead to gross injustice under his own example of communism. He says it's a double standard, but my response is that it's not individual freedom of speech. It's not individual freedom of speech that was being used here. Rather, it was a community using their moral standards, believing in communism, to kill millions of people. leading me to my third and final voting issue. The worst of free speech is insults, but the worst of moral standards is mass death. That really made me sound like the Grim Reaper there. I'm sorry. Anyway, but you get the idea. The worst of free speech, if you vote for free speech, you get the best of having free speech, and the worst, the only disadvantage you get is insults. But the worst of moral standards is mass death. Again, pardoning me for being the Grim Reaper, my opponent doesn't have a single body count responsible for free speech, while I have substantiated numerous times that moral standards have murdered millions. Thank you for your time. I appreciate the time to judge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judge.
Thank you so much. I appreciate you coming to judge. Thank you so much. I appreciate you coming. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.